very, very pleased to welcome Gary Williams, who many of you know because he is a philosophy man, up in the attic at the Y Centre. And today he's going to talk, is Darwin relevant today? So Gary, you are very, very welcome. Thank you, everybody.
Well, thank you for that. Thank you for coming. I've been a fan of Darwin since, I was looking back, since I was in junior school, actually. So I really should thank the U3A today for the opportunity to indulge my passion in giving the talk. And I'd like to thank Andrew Collier, there he is right in front of me, who actually founded and sustains the Philosophy and Ideas group. And in fact gave me the idea of the title of the talk today. So thanks for that, Andrew. Okay, is Darwin relevant today? Well, yes. I'll take questions now. One eminent philosopher has claimed that the theory of evolution by natural selection was the greatest idea to enter the mind of man, for man, really, humankind. I wouldn't want to argue for that claim. I think it's a bit over the top. But Darwin was not the first to describe the process of natural selection, after all. What he did do was brilliantly marshal and present the evidence for it, so that he's rightly regarded, I think, to be the originator of the theory. And that theory, Darwinism, partly because it included humans in its purview. There was only one line in The Origin of Species related to humans, but everyone knew that that was his intent. Because of that, it's been enormously influential, and there's implications that we should find pertinent today, and I want to talk about a few of those. And rather than describe numerous examples and then the necessity of little depth, I'm just going to look at two that I think and hope you'll find interesting. Hope you do, obviously. But first, I should be giving a relatively brief biography of Darwin himself. I mean, some of you, all of you will have heard his name, I'm sure, but some of you may not know much about his life and work, so we'll start off by doing that. Well, he was born the 12th of February 1809, a significant date because across the pond, Abraham Lincoln was born on exactly the same day. Darwin was born in Shrewsbury into a very, very wealthy family. His mother, Susanna Wedgwood, was a granddaughter of Josiah Wedgwood, the pottery manufacturer. And Charles's father, Robert, who was himself the son of the humanist Erasmus Darwin, was a doctor who had enriched himself by speculating on the canals and so on, the Industrial Revolution, as well as being a great doctor in his own right, a very wealthy man. Darwin was educated locally before in 1825 he was sent to study medicine at Edinburgh. His father had also studied there, and his brother, his older brother Erasmus, was already at Edinburgh studying medicine. Darwin found surgery in those days with no anaesthetic very distressing. He apparently ran out of the room when he saw it first. And some of the lectures dull. But he did learn taxidermy from a freed black slave called John Edmonston, and he attended the geological lectures of a man called Robert Jameson. He later claimed in his autobiography that the lectures were boring, but not for the only time. I think Darwin was fibbing, actually, because some very recent research by a man in Edinburgh, in fact, has suggested that Jameson's lectures made mention of an Italian naturalist. His name was Giambattista Brocchi. He was a jurist and a naturalist, and he was a conchologist. A conchologist is somebody who studies shells off the beach. But in his case, he studied fossil shells that were found in the Apennine Mountains. And as a result of that, Brocchi put forward the idea that species are discrete, that there are gaps between different species, and that their appearance changes little through time, but there's a reduction in what he called their reproductive vitality. I know what he means, actually. So that they age and eventually go extinct. So for brocci, species were discrete and relatively stable, and they eventually went extinct. Darwin also joined a society called the Linnean Society. It was a society for student naturalists in Edinburgh. That society was led by a man called Robert Grant. Pretty well everyone in this story who's male is called Robert for some reason. I mean, just purely coincidentally. Robert Grant, anyway, who in turn described the work to Darwin of Lamarck. Lamarck was a French naturalist who himself had put forward a theory of evolution about 20 years before the time we're talking about. And Lamarck is famous for his idea of the inheritance of acquired characters. So that, for example, the old blacksmith builds up his muscles through his work, and those large muscles could be inherited by his sons, or possibly even his daughters. But for Lamarck, there was no such. He had various metaphysical views, and one of those implied that there could be no extinctions of any species, and no gaps could there be between any species. He believed in something called the plenum, and that imposed views on Lamarck, which suggested there could be no species extinction and no real gaps between the species. So for brocci, species were discrete, gaps between them, and stable. They didn't change that much before they went extinct. Whereas for Lamarck, species almost merged together. There were very tiny gaps between them, and they did change through time. I'll just come back to the distinction between these two before. So Darwin, whereas he said he found the lectures boring and he didn't get much out of them, it's very likely that his time at Edinburgh was actually quite fruitful as regards his later career. Remember, he's only 17 or 18 at this time. Anyway, so he didn't like medicine. He couldn't stand the sight of operations and so on. And so shrewdly, his father then sent him to Cambridge University, again following his brother, to study for a general degree with a view towards becoming a country parson. Pretty well par for the course in those days. He joined in the popular craze for beetle collecting and became enamoured then of natural history once more. He was befriended by a botany professor. Nice when the professors fraternise with you, that way around. A man called John Henslow. And they became real buddies to the extent that Darwin was called the man who walks with Henslow. Darwin delighted in studying natural theology. Natural theology is this idea that you can find evidence for God by examining the natural world. The properties of the natural world suggest that there is a God. That's natural theology. And he did pretty well in his final exams. He was 10th out of 178. But he'd always lingered a hope to study natural history in the tropics. And in preparation, he studied geology, and a man called Adam Sedgwick, a Reverend Adam Sedgwick, one of the few people who wasn't called Robert, he was called Adam Sedgwick. And then he joined him for 2 weeks mapping strata in North Wales. When he returned home from that expedition in August 1831, he found a letter from Henslow proposing him as a naturalist to be self-funded on the Beagle, whose captain was, you guessed it, Robert Fitzroy. And that ship was about to depart on a 2-year voyage charting the coastline of South America. Charles's father disapproved of this expedition. He thought it was nothing but bad news for Charles, but he was persuaded to change his mind after his brother-in-law, Josiah Wedgwood II now, said it would be grand preparation for life as a parson. So Charles went on this expedition in a private capacity. He was a naturalist, but in a private capacity. And that's important, because what it meant was that when he came back, the collections of animals and plants and fossils and so on, he had control over them. They weren't the property of the Admiralty, which they would have been if he'd been paid to go on the expedition. The voyage, say, planned for 2 years, lasted 5, And as Darwin said in his autobiography, it was undoubtedly the most important event in his life. Just as an aside, he didn't, as is so often claimed, discover evolution whilst he was on the Galapagos Islands, as a result of studying the various finches that he found there. He gave no great attention to their collection at all, and he only came to appreciate the significance, the fact that in numerous species each adapted to a particular diet, when those birds were studied by an ornithologist, John Gould, back home in London, after the Beagle expedition had finished. However, some recent scholars have argued that while he was actually on the Beagle himself, between 1831 and 1836, Darwin was examining his findings with a view to determining whether either Brocchi or Lamarck, those two naturalists I mentioned, best described what he saw. It's claimed that he was actually looking at his evidence in a view to deciding between those two naturalists. Both of them were called, in fact, Gian Battista and Jean Baptiste. They were both called John the Baptist in English. It's tempting to see them as harbingers of the great one who's to follow them, but I think that's pushing the analogy a bit too far. Darwin took a lot of notes while he was on the expedition, on the Beagle, a huge number of notes, and he wrote in what's come to be called his ornithological notes. And this was written probably, it's thought, towards the end of the expedition. The zoology of archipelagos, things like places like the Galapagos and the Falklands, which he also visited, will be well worth examining. For such facts, that is, different tortoises on different islands, there were two types of foxes on the West and East Falkland Islands. Such facts, he said, would undermine the stability of species. Some people take that as evidence that he was already an evolutionist while he was on the Beagle. There's no evidence that that's true. And in fact, a great American scholar, a great Darwinist, has dated his conversion, that is, to becoming a transmutationist, to believe in evolution, to March 1837, just 6 months after he'd returned from the Beagle voyage. And that's when he started all his notebooks in earnest, his transmutation notebooks. Specimens that he brought back, as I say, he was able to dispense himself to various experts because they belonged to him. They didn't belong to the Admiralty. People like John Gould, Richard Owen, and a number of other people, he gave them specimens. He kept back some invertebrates which he intended to study himself and publish on himself. Just a couple of years after his return, he married his first cousin, Emma Wedgwood. And a couple of years after that, the family, there was one child at that time, moved from London to Down House in Down in Kent, where Emma provided another 9 children over the next 15 years, typical for Victorian paterfamilias, and 7 lived to adulthood. He communicated with an enormous number of naturalists. If he'd had the internet, he would never have been off it. Letters coming into Down House every day, four deliveries a day. Animal breeders, pigeon fanciers, all sorts of people were grist to the mill. And he wrote out a short sketch of his theory, his developing theory of evolution. Excuse me. Just 30 pages or so, in 1842, and he followed that with a much longer essay, over 200 pages, in 1844. And he told Emma that if he died, she should get that published. The idea of natural selection had come to him, he claimed, and there's no reason to think he was wrong, in 1838, not long after he got back from the Beagle. He read Robert Malthus's book, an essay on population. Malthus was this reverend, one of the early people who studied population dynamics. And Malthus had argued poverty would always be part of the human condition because population numbers would increase exponentially and the curve would sort of bend upwards, if you like. whereas food production will always increase just geometrically, that is in a straight line, so that the population will always outrun the food supply. There'll always be poverty. Malthus only wrote about humans. Darwin saw that that could be applied to the entire natural world, and under those conditions there would be a struggle for life, as he called it. And the better adapted animals would be more likely to survive and reproduce. And given offspring tend to resemble their parents, the offspring of such better adapted parents would tend to prosper too. So any beneficial changes which produced such well-adapted individuals would be preserved. And that's pretty much the theory of natural selection. In other words, through time, will lead to the development of a new species, evolution by natural selection. He claimed a theory by which to work as a result of reading Malthus. But he didn't publish that theory, which he wrote out in quite some detail in 1844, until 1859, in other words, quite a long time later. And it's been claimed that was basically delayed publishing, and people have sought various explanations for why he did delay publishing. But there's no reason to think he did delay publishing. There was no delay as such, because what did he have to do in the meantime? Well, first of all, he had to finish writing up, as he was obliged to do, all the notes that he'd taken during the Beagle voyage. 4 books were published as a result of Darwin's findings on the Beagle, and he was instrumental in bringing those books about. So the book today is called The Voyage of the Beagle, or The Beagle Diaries. And that took best part of 3 years. And then, as I said, he had kept back one of the groups of animals that he wanted to study, the invertebrates. And in particular, he started studying barnacles. He anticipated spending about 2 years studying barnacles, but in the end he decided to study every living and every fossil species of barnacle. And it took him 8 years. The works were published in 1854 in 4 volumes, and those volumes are still in print today and are still used by specialists who work on barnacles. So there was no delay. And as soon as he finished his barnacle work, he put it aside and he started writing his big book, which he intended to call Natural Selection. He started that in about 1854, 1855. By June 1858, he'd written a lot of it. He was hard at work. It's been a monumental volume, laying out and arguing for his theory to be called natural selection. But on a date that's gone down in some sort of infamy in Darwin scholarship, it was the 18th of June, 1858. It was actually 2 days after the hottest day of the summer of the Great Stink. 1858 was the month, June 1858 was the month when Parliament had to move out of the Houses of Parliament because the stench from the River Thames was so overpowering that they had to move out. So this was 2 days after the hottest day of the summer. I can imagine Darwin sitting in Down House, waving a letter to cool himself down, and he received a letter or paper from a naturalist who was known to him, and that man is probably known to many of you. His name was Alfred Russel Wallace, who was collecting in the Malay archipelago. And enclosed with his letter was a paper describing a theory of evolution and the mechanism natural selection. Not called that by Wallace, but clearly the same theory. Darwin was shattered to some extent, and as a result of maybe a few shenanigans going on, it's not clear exactly what happened. A few weeks later, at a meeting of the Linnean Society, this paper of Wallace's and some items of Darwin's writings, in particular an excerpt from that 1844 essay I talked about, and a letter that he had sent to an American biologist, were read out at the meeting of the Linnean Society, to absolutely no response whatsoever, of course. Anyway, as a result of that, Darwin abandoned his big book and wrote an abstract, 500 pages, published in November 1859, on the origin of species. This time, of course, was a very significant response, both positive and negative. Darwin soon turned his attention to the more pacific endeavours. His next book was on the pollination of orchids. Absolutely wonderful book. But by the late 1860s, he was ready to publish his views on how his theory dealt with mankind, humankind, the mind, and he published a book called The Expression of Emotions in Man and the Animals. And just a year later, in fact a year earlier I should say, a book called The Descent of Man, where mankind now took centre stage, rather than just one line referring to humans in the origin. This entire book supposedly was about the evolution of man, although much of it actually was about sexual selection. These books were very popular. His later writings were primarily about plants. He had a huge greenhouse and gardens that he did his own experiments in. And his last book, as a result of 40 years of intermittent work, and which sold more than any of the other books, was called The Formation of Vegetable Mould Through the Action of Worms, which again, it sounds awful. It's an absolutely wonderful book to read. It's short, pithy, recommend it to anybody. Still in print, of course. Anyway, about a year later, Darwin died of heart failure. And as a result of petitioning by colleagues, he was buried at Westminster Abbey a week later. He never became an atheist. He did lose his Christian faith, and he did not recant on his deathbed, which is another of these myths that you occasionally see when people talk about Darwin, that he'd actually recanted on his deathbed. No, that didn't happen. Okay. So it's a sufficiently detailed biography of Darwin, I think, to be going on with at least. As I say, his legacy has been immense. One of the great biologists of the last century, a man called Theodosius Dobzhansky, said that nothing in biology makes sense except in the light of evolution. That was in a 1973 essay, and it's still true today. And it was difficult for me, really, to know what to leave out. I didn't want to do too many topics, because then there'd only been a few minutes on each, and it wouldn't have been able to develop anything at all, say anything interesting about any of them. But just to give you some idea of just some of the other topics that I'm not going to be talking about today. Eugenics, human enhancement, future evolution of humans and or animals, GM crops, GM animals, animal and human behavior, natural selection in design. I mean, people who work, for example, on design of intelligent systems today, one of the methods that's used is basically natural selection. You may have heard of these programs today, things like AlphaGo, AlphaZero, which are stronger than any chess grandmaster, stronger than any Go player in the world. And those programs really work by playing games against each other, millions of games against each other, and selecting out those programs which win the most games. It's effectively natural selection on a computer. But I'm not going to be talking about any of those things. I hope the ones I do talk about will be of general interest. So here goes. So the first one goes into the sort of general name of Darwinian medicine. It doesn't sound very exciting, I must admit. It's really about how Darwinism leads to a better understanding of our health and disease and so on. Now remember, natural selection, the process by which the better adapted animals preferentially survive and reproduce, has no handle, no influence on any other feature of our lives, especially our post-reproductive lives. Neither does it operate to ensure our happiness or feelings of well-being. Nothing to do with that. Lastly, it's usually, not always, but usually a slow process, so that it's likely that many of the bodily and psychological attributes we have today were evolved or were adaptive in a very different environment, possibly when we were just living in small groups, living in perhaps the bush or savannah or whatever of Africa. And lastly, before I get on to Darwinian medicine proper, evolution is what's called a tinkerer. It has to use what it's got. In other words, you can't see something adaptive in the future and go to it by any route it likes. It doesn't have any view of the future. It can't have any foresight. It just uses what it's got. It cannot sacrifice adaptiveness now for a better future design. Okay, let's look at some of the areas where this sort of idea has really become imported in recent years. Probably the major factor throughout human history impacting the health of humans and other animals, for that matter, has been pathogens and things like bacteria and viruses, worms, etc., that today bring misery to hundreds of millions of people. All these animals and bacteria have very short generation times, and so they can evolve much faster than us, of course. Hence the problem with things like antibiotic resistance, where we're always running to stay where we are, and in fact running to be going backwards these days. And we have what are called, in evolutionary terms, we have what are called arms races versus these pathogens. We adapt to them, they evolve to get around our adaptations. We have a further adaptation, but they get around that, and so on and so forth. It's like an arms race between two superpowers. And it's been suggested, and almost certainly correctly, I think, that the reason sex evolved in multicellular animals was as a result of these sort of arms races against pathogens. Sex produces a lot of variety, and that variety is necessary, it says, to combat the attacks of pathogens. More mundanely, things like fever. Fever is a sophisticated, evolved mechanism. It isn't just something that happens to you. You feel a bit hot and bothered. It's a sophisticated mechanism to combat infection. It's not a mistake. The body temperature is still carefully regulated. It's just at a higher temperature to kill the pathogens. Another thing that's it's been found to be dependent on our evolved response to pathogens are iron levels in the blood. Bacteria have a crucial need for iron. So, for example, people who have chronic tubercular conditions have mechanisms to sequester the iron and lower it in its blood concentration. We haven't known that for very long. In fact, doctors years ago used to give people iron when they had tuberculosis because they think they were wasting away and they needed iron. It's the last thing they wanted, as it turned out, because it harms patients with infections. One of the chemicals, in fact, that binds iron is lactoferrin, and that's found in its highest levels in breast milk, obviously to protect the newborn from infections. Sneezing and coughing. It appears that primarily these benefit the pathogens, not us, in that they aid their dispersal. They are manipulating us, so bacteria and viruses are manipulating us. Why do we sneeze, for example? Why do we cough? Well, we think it's to get rid of harmful things, and in a sense it is, but of course it's doing the pathogens a world of good. Coughs and sneezes spread diseases, right? And as a result of that, some clever clogs made a prediction that diseases spread by personal contact are less virulent than those conveyed by other vectors, like insects, for example. Why? Well, because if it's spread by personal contact and the host is too unwell to come into contact with other people, that is, potential victims, this is deleterious to the pathogen. In that case, it doesn't want to be too virulent, does it? And that prediction was actually confirmed and has now been well documented. So it's likely that these views are something going for them. They're probably likely, in fact, to be actually correct. Another thing that impacts severely on health are toxins. For example, plants are not here for our benefit. They don't generally want to be eaten. Some do, but mostly they don't. So many contain more or less toxic chemicals, and they often impart strong odours and flavours. It's been suggested, for example, that the nausea and food aversions that women suffer during pregnancy evolved to protect the fetus from those toxins. And many young children, it's been found, I can vouch for this personally, dislike strongly favoured vegetables. You know, broccoli and sprouts, that type of thing. Ugh, don't like those. Probably for the same reason, because they tend to be those sort of vegetables that contain high levels of toxins. Another area, injuries. Possibility of injuries may have been selected for the predisposition to develop phobias. Hasn't it ever bothered you that we develop phobias quite easily to things like spiders and snakes and so on, but not towards things like electrical sockets or knives, the things that are actually dangerous today? We don't develop phobias to things like that. Only to things like spiders and snakes, which are not really that much of a problem in Porthcawl, are they? But of course, in the past, those were the things that were dangerous. And then you come to the genetic diseases. Why are genes, such as those that cause Huntington's chorea, for example, not eliminated by natural selection? Well, as I said earlier on, natural selection doesn't select for health per se, but for reproductive success. Huntington's doesn't impact on reproductive success. It only manifests itself later on in life. And so it can't be eliminated by natural selection. Another one, cystic fibrosis. We've all heard of that. Horrible condition. Unlike Huntington's, you need 2 copies of the faulty gene to get the illness there. And usually you have a relatively early death. So why does it persist in the population, that gene? Well, because if you only have 1 copy of that faulty gene, it gives a much better resistance to malaria. To diarrhea. So those people who've only got 1 copy of the gene, as children in particular, died less often as a result of diarrhea. So that is the mechanism by which that cystic fibrosis gene is maintained in the population. Sickle cell anemia is very similar. If you have 2 copies, you get sickle cell anemia, terrible disease, likely to die fairly young. If you've got 1 copy, then you have much more resistant to malaria. And of course, where is sickle cell anemia found? It's found in those parts of the world where malaria is endemic. So again, it all fits together very nicely into a pattern whereby natural selection is the major factor in understanding many of these conditions. And then one more I just wanted to briefly mention, because I think it's of interest to all of us. Why do we get older? Why do we age better? Why do we show senescence? That is the process of bodily deterioration as we age. Well, Darwinism says even without senescence, you'll eventually die of illness or accident or something. And hence the ability to reproduce at greater and greater ages promotes less reproductive benefit, and hence is less amenable to selection. So as you get older, you're less likely to have children in the future. And so natural selection has less and less hold over you in that sense. So as you get older and older, natural selection has little effect. And it can't stop you, in the sense, from aging. So, for example, many genes which are known, which favour the animal it finds itself in when young, but it disfavours it when older. This is one that's close to my heart at the moment. A gene which influences calcium metabolism. So I've got a problem with my calcium metabolism at the moment. In young, promotes faster healing of bones, which is a good thing. But in the older person, elevates calcium deposition in the arteries. Bad. But given that my reproductive days are over, natural selection can't do anything about it. So you can understand why some things are good in young animals, bad in older ones. Because the older people are not reproducing, it can't be eliminated by natural selection. There's no way you can take it out. Keep an eye on it. I've only got 20 minutes left, so I'm not going to go through all these, I don't think. But then quickly to finish this part of the talk, You all know we got things like blind spots in our eyes, persistent back problems, a predilection for sugars and fats, certainly have, all due to our evolutionary ancestry, no doubt. Okay, I'll leave it there, because I want to give time to the last part of the talk, and I've been told that I really have to finish the talk by 3:15 so we can have some questions. There were some other things I wanted to say, but they'll keep for another day. Okay, the other part of the second part I wanted to do, second item I wanted to talk about, something quite different. In fact, I chose this because I thought it might be more interesting than some of the other topics I mentioned earlier. Apologies if I'm wrong about that. But I want to talk about, does Darwinism have any implications for the meaning of life? Partly chose that because we've had some sessions in the Philosophy and Ideas group, which I heartily endorse it, and you should come along to it. It's wonderful. You don't need to be a bloody PhD in philosophy to enjoy it, I'm going to show you. Come along. But some of these topics have come up through time, one fairly recently, about the meaning of life. That is, does belief in evolution by natural selection imply a world without purpose or meaning? And if so, can we live a fully human life in such a world? You see, up until recently, in the last 2,000 years in the West, Christianity and various political ideologies have provided a meaning to life for many people. They've really disappeared now. Christianity, to a large degree, has a hold over us, and political ideologies likewise. So what's left? What's left to give us meaning to life? Christianity, we had a definite, temporally limited story with a beginning, a middle, now, and predicted end. One that made us the central players, the central concern. It's a cosmos where a creator God plays a definite and ongoing role, and that's one where we have a clear picture of directions, of ends, of purposes for God and for us. Our end then was to worship and obey and come to a fellowship with God. That was Augustine's city of God. All else in our life would follow from that. The idea of materialism, all is matter, no gods, atoms in the void, which slowly more and more thinkers came to adopt. Well, that of course countenances no immaterial or immortal soul, no God, and a much more limited fellowship if there is a God. So how did these materialistic evolutionary ideas influence the sorts of things I'm talking about? Darwin's origin certainly implied that the theory applied to all of nature, including us. But its early impact on Christianity was much, much less than generally thought today. It's generally thought that after 1859, all hell broke loose and everybody threw Christianity out of the window. I mean, that didn't happen at all. And in fact, the nonconformist churches accommodated to it fairly readily. And in fact, the acceptance of it was due in no small part to evolution seeming to supply or have progressive credentials. It was seen as a progressive force. Evolution was progressing towards some end, and whatever that end was, but at least it was progressing. It was an optimistic idea. And as I said, and this is something I've mentioned in talks I've given to the philosophy group, that the acceptance of evolution was facilitated by this understanding, as they thought then, that it was a progressive force. That idea in particular was espoused and championed for donkey's years through millions and millions of words by a man called Herbert Spencer. However, opinions changed, and today it's widely accepted that evolution has no end, no goal, no purpose, and implies no progress by itself. Just some responses to a view such as that. What about this one? For millions, this life is a sad vale of tears, sitting around with nothing really to say. What scientists say we're just simply spiraling coils of self-replicating DNA. That was actually Monty Python. And this one, I couldn't resist. It's not a response to Darwinism, this, of course, but how could you miss this out? Life's but a walking shadow, a poor player that struts and frets his hour upon the stage and then is heard no more. It is a tale told by an idiot, full of sound and fury, signifying nothing. And this from a recent theologian. If there is no God, the world is the result of a cosmic accident. There is no reason for which it exists. As for man, he is a freak of nature, a blind product of matter and time and chance. Man is just a lump of slime that evolved into rationality. Ooh, dear. And finally, I wanted to read this. I'm a great fan of Thomas Hardy, and this is virtually the first poem he ever wrote, just after the Origin was published. It's called Hap. If by some vengeful god would call to me from up the sky and laugh, thou suffering thing, know that thy sorrow is my ecstasy, that thy love's loss is my hate's profiting. Then will I bear it, clench myself and die, steeled by the sense of ire unmerited, half eased in that a powerful ear than I had willed and meted me the tears I shed. But not so. How arrives it then that joy lies slain, and why unblooms the best hope ever sown? So Hardy's saying that if there was no a God who meted out these punishments, possibly even arbitrarily, he could put up with that. He'd think, oh well, maybe I deserved it. But what he couldn't tolerate, well, he had to, but he couldn't, was the idea that this godless world was so uncaring and led to so much misery and pain. And of course, that's a great theme of Hardy's novels. If you think of some of his great novels, Far from the Madding Crowd and Tess of the D'Urbervilles. I mean, these sort of fateful accidents are the fulcrum which the whole novel turns. Now, of course, Darwinism doesn't necessitate atheism, but its acceptance, as it came to be accepted in the second half of the 19th century, did make atheism intellectually acceptable. This, together with the random nature of the mutations leading to change, did play a significant role in the unravelling of belief for many. I mean, not all, of course, not all today, by any means. So, without God, then, can the world or human life have meaning? As you've seen for Hardy, probably not. For the existentialists, probably not. Just to be clear, though, what's the meaning of meaning? Well, roughly, what I've defined it as for the purpose of the next 10 or 15 minutes is something of value, of worth, something to be desired. It may not be the best definition, maybe you can think of other ones, as long as they're not too different. But more importantly, I think, or as important, there are two types of meanings. There are objective meanings. Objective meaning is an intrinsic feature of the world given to us. It's in the world, and we take part of it. We take that meaning from the world. It's an intrinsic feature of the world. A subjective meaning is not an intrinsic feature of the world. It's a meaning created by us. It's not in the world as we create it. That's a subjective meaning. Now, if we were made by God, then surely objective meaning does exist. Some people argue otherwise. Freddie Eyre, for example, in a very famous paper, did so. It consists in living one's life in obedience to God's wishes and commands, and with the promise of eternal life to come. Without God, and given Darwinism with its implications that humans are but another twig on the tree of life, it is difficult to see how meaning and purpose can be objective or intrinsic, a part of the furniture of the world. Well, of course, as I say, even today, many people do so argue. I think they're wrong. I believe Darwinism does preclude a belief in objective meaning. Darwinism, like all scientific statement, deals in his statements, and by itself cannot tell us how we ought to live our lives. Okay, so how do we find subjective meaning then? It's created by us. You have to accept that there's no meaning of life. You can only look for meanings, plural, in life. We put them there, right? So where might we seek such subjective meanings? Well, can the evolutionary process itself provide one? Many people, I've already mentioned Herbert Spencer, and people like Julian Huxley, and today Ed Wilson, for example, have thought you could. You could actually read the evolutionary process to give us a meaning for life. Because for them, evolution really does imply progress, as I've said, cultural progress. And that description of human advancement, for these people, easily or readily translated into a prescriptive process. In other words, a description of the world led to what you should do in the world, how you should behave, what's good, what's bad, and all the rest of it. So that led people like Julian Huxley and others to various moral judgments, which they took out of the evolutionary process, the working out of the evolutionary process within society. That really doesn't have a very good press today, partly because it's been nobbled by being called social Darwinism. Social Darwinism is one of those phrases that, if people have heard of it, they sort of throw up their hands in horror and say, "Ugh, I don't want anything to do with that." It's really an idea that hasn't fared very well at all. In other words, the idea that how you behave, how the political systems are, acceptable or not, owe anything to the evolutionary process is something that's just not accepted anymore today. I've got some qualms about it myself, but anyway, that's not for me to say. So generally, the idea that can you find meaning from the evolutionary process, most people today argue, no, you can't. Okay, so what's next? So we have to rely on ourselves then, it seems. You can't take any out of the world, you can't take it out of the evolutionary process itself. We have to find it within ourselves. We must find meaning for ourselves. As Sartre said, we're condemned to freedom. So what guidelines might we have? You'll notice there's very little to do with Darwinism anymore, which is why I was worried about putting it in, but I thought it's intrinsic interest. Perhaps a bit more interested than GM crops, for example, swung me to putting it in. I apologise for that. The concept of human nature, complicated and contested one. Charles has promised to give us a talk on it, which I'm looking forward to. Seems to be delayed more often than bloody Brexit, but anyway. But I think the idea can be of value in that it dictates what might count towards the meaning of life. So we are, in practice, maybe not essentially, but in practice certainly a social species. So that's when Aristotle claimed the meaningful life is to live out human nature to the full. He wrote this. It's only a short quote. But the fact that it was 2,500 years ago doesn't mean it's of no value today. Because Aristotle wrote 3 chapters of a book about friendship. Friendship is a kind of virtue, or implies virtue, and it is also most necessary for living. Nobody would choose to live without friends, even if he had all the other good things. Indeed, those who hold wealth and office and power are thought to stand in special need of friends. For what is the use of such prosperity to them if they are denied the opportunity for beneficence, which is most commonly and most commendably directed towards friends? For Aristotle, the good life, to a large extent, consisted of friendships. One of the most important factors in living a good or meaningful life. It doesn't sound very subtle, but I think it's got a lot going for it. The other thing that Aristotle said, I'm a big fan of Aristotle, certainly he said we shouldn't ignore our human nature. I mean, we would say our evolved human nature. Of course, Aristotle didn't believe in evolution, but he believed we had a human nature, and we shouldn't ignore that in determining what constitutes the good life. And again, for Aristotle, what was distinctive about man, humans, was that we are the rational animal. The life of the mind, he said, a contemplative life, could provide meaning. I won't read you the quote, I'm running a bit short of time. I'm sure in this he was surely right. I mean, as I say, isn't that why we love the U3A? The contemplative life can be lived for its own sake. There's no end other than contemplating. Not just your navel. Just the life of contemplation is wonderful in itself for Aristotle, and I agree with him. And then recent writers have proposed, I say recent, in the last 500 years, and philosophy is a long time frame, at least the following other possibilities as sources of meaning. And this is a common one, you'll have heard this. As long as you think your life is meaningful, it is. As long as you're happy, we say to our children, don't we? As long as you're happy, you know. Sisyphus in Greek mythology was condemned by the gods to eternally push a stone up a hill. At the top, it rolled back down again. French existentialist called Albert Camus, the myth of Sisyphus, it was a book he wrote, obviously, suggested that maybe the struggle itself confers meaning on his life. The last line of the book is, we must imagine Sisyphus happy. And if he's happy, what else do you want? Well, looking at it from the outside, it seems a bit bloody pointless, doesn't it? Pushing a stone up, then it rolls down, and you push it back up again. Right? I commuted on the M25 for 20 years. I can sympathise. Anyway, is happiness all that we want? Can it alone give our life meaning? Robert Nozick, American philosopher who's dead now, described the possibility of a person being linked up forever to a pleasure machine on which you would experience, and you wouldn't know it at the time that you were linked up, you would experience unending pleasure or happiness. Would you accept the offer to be linked up? Hands up. Usually you get about 2 out of 80 putting their hands up. Why wouldn't you put your hand up? Why wouldn't you want a life of unending pleasure? Well, it seems that we want our lives to be authentic. We want to be, as far as is possible, the author of our life, not a passive participant. But then if that's true, happiness or pleasure alone isn't enough for a meaningful life, is it? Can't be. Okay, so what's next then? What else could we perhaps suggest? Well, from an individual perspective still, life might be meaningful if it fulfills some significant personal goal or purpose, develops some skill or proficiency or knowledge, but then the meaning seems to reside in the future. And when the goal is achieved, what then? Do you set another one? Can such a life really be meaningful? Can deciding to make the world's biggest collection of beer mats be meaningful? How about stamps or books or anything? Do we have to achieve to give our lives meaning? What about those people who are not able to achieve things, various disabilities and so on? Are their lives without meaning? Or as Milton said in his fantastic, on his blindness, do they not also serve or only stand and wait? So it may not be necessary to achieve anything great to have meaning. So we're still searching there, are we? What about a group perspective, helping others? Meaning then, or meanings then, from providing help or service to others. Helping others, it's argued, should be done as a means to an end, the betterment of those helped, not because the activity in itself is good or provides meaning. And again, what about those who are unable to help others? Not everyone's in a position to help other people. For various reasons. Are their lives meaningless? However, it seems inarguable that concern for and engagement with others, even if only with family members, is an important ingredient in a meaningful life, with a proviso that it should not be done in pursuance of a meaningful life. It should be done to help the people you're trying to help, not looking for a meaningful life. And there's a wonderful line from Middlemarch by George Eliot, which really says that in a nutshell. Far better I can say it if I could when we drop the quotes, it doesn't matter. And then finally, and this is what we were debating some time ago in the philosophy group, just about time. And this is from the, do we find meaning, or can we find meaning from the perspective of humanity? We should act, some people say. I'm looking at no one. And we'll find purpose or meaning to ensure the survival of our species. I find major problems with this proposal. Perhaps the least of my concerns is that evolution doesn't act at the level of the species, but the level of the gene or the individual, or in some special circumstances, the group. It's unlikely, I think, that our evolved psychology engages with others at such an abstract level as the species. What's valuable about our species is to be found at the level of its individual members. We care for human beings, not humankind. So that's my first problem with the view that you can have a sort of species-wide perspective on meaning. What gives our lives meaning is care for the whole of humanity and ensuring that it goes on. Secondly, the second problem I have with it is it suffers from an argument first put forward by a man called Derek Parfit, who's an Oxford philosopher who died just a few months ago, who indicated that this humanity view has the implication that helping to bring about a world where there are billions of people whose lives are barely worth living, or I would say, or even not worth living, would be a good thing in many scenarios, and could confer meaning on our lives today, even though their lives have no value to them at all. The fact that they're alive and perpetuating the species under this view would be a good thing and something we should aim for rather than leave the species go extinct. Now, I find that bizarre, and I hope most of you do as well. So I'll just finish. Said nothing about Darwinism for the last 15 minutes, but there we are. By suggesting that life does have meanings, not a meaning, one big meaning, with a capital M and singular, but meanings. It has meanings because it's valuable and precious to us. And perhaps you'd agree, I'll just finish with, this is a poem, very little known. I couldn't find it, I've got an anthology of the poems of Matthew Arnold, and it's not in there at all. Why, I don't know. It's called Light. It's very short. Is it so small a thing to have enjoyed the sun, to have lived light in the spring, to have loved, to have thought, to have done, to have advanced true friends and beat down baffling foes? I don't think I can think of a better way of summing up my own views than that. And that's where I'd like to finish. Thanks very much. There we are.
Thank you, Gary. Wonderful talk, as usual. I wish I could join this philosophy group that you constantly refer to. It sounds like a real fund of ideas. The white-hot intellectual heart of Porthcawl, perhaps. It would seem to me that this is I'm not quite sure how to ask this question, but it seems to me that what you're saying is that Darwinism and evolution and so on and so forth do not provide a moral basis for any kind, or a basis for any kind of morality. That human beings are not particularly more worthy or worthful than any other organism, and they're just a natural product of some process which Darwin gave us some insight into. And what you seem to be suggesting is that the only way you can make life worthwhile is really by ignoring Darwin and just getting on with making friends. Would that be an adequate summary of your moral position?
I'm not entirely saying it'd be mine. It wouldn't be a bad position to take, though. I mean, to be honest, even though he didn't know anything about Darwinism, clearly, I don't think Aristotle ever said anything outside the scientific world. We can dispense with his science now, but in terms of his philosophy and his general approach to life, I find a lot to be said for what did the Greek do for us? Well, yeah, he gave us a worldview I think that's as good as any. Yeah, I mean, what would life be like without friends? I mean, just as an example, I'm not saying that's the only thing. There are people who presumably have no friends and maybe consider themselves happy. I couldn't imagine it myself. But we're a strange species, aren't we? I mean, people are so different. And what people find acceptable or even pleasurable, is so varied. I wouldn't want to say, because I say the idea of human nature, I think, is problematic for me. I don't think we've got an essence in the sense that there is something constitutive of humans. In other words, something that we have to be a human. For Aristotle, you had to be rational to be a human. Aristotle was quite happy, for example, for young infants to be exposed. If the father, this was the mother, if the father didn't want them, they could be exposed and died. Now, that's repugnant to us today. But the reason he believed that that wasn't a crime, and in fact could be a good thing in certain circumstances, was because he believed they weren't rational. Because if they weren't rational, they weren't a human person. And therefore didn't have the same rights as other human persons. Because for Aristotle, he thought that humans, like everything, had an essence, something that was constitutive of being a human. And for him, it was rationality. If you had rationality, you were human. If you didn't have it, you weren't human. I don't believe that. I don't think we've got an essence. I don't think really we've got a human nature. So there's no one thing you would say to me and say, well, is the good having friends, or is the good working for others? I would say, well, in certain circumstances, and for some people, yes. Other circumstances, for other people, not necessarily. That's a pathetic answer, but I don't think you can be dogmatic in this area. I mean, if you want a good answer that people say, yeah, you could be on the front page of the Daily Mail, then you end up being dogmatic. And I don't think you can be in this area. That's all I can say, I think. I think Jeff wanted a question.
The future is supposed to be artificial intelligence. Not us. Artificial intelligence. And the society or country that adopts it to the best end will rule the world. But artificial intelligence will rule the world, not the society that adopts it. Will it have a form of natural selection, survival of the species, survival of the best? Because we're going to have to rely on it. If you get these programs, they're not going to be friends with each other. They'll talk to each other, they'll communicate. Will they progress using Darwinian principles?
Well, I mean, there's only three things are necessary for natural selection to take place. You need a collection of items that show variability, that the offspring are more similar to the parents than they are to a random member, so these things would have to reproduce themselves, and the sons and daughters, if you like, would have to be more akin to the parents than to the program in general. Okay, and then there would have to be a struggle between them, so that not all of them could survive. Now, whether all those things could come about with machines or non-human or non-animal substrate, well, of course, I haven't got a clue any more than anybody else. I mean, you see articles in the paper every day now. Are we going to lose control of these things? Are they going to be so powerful? And will they be malevolent, or will they just be indifferent to us? I think being indifferent probably even worse than being malevolent. I mean, I'd rather if somebody thought badly of me than didn't think of me at all. But I haven't got a clue, really. At the moment, we can pull the plug out. Will we be able to do that in the future? I mean, we're so dependent on them now. We wouldn't want to pull the plug out, would we? You could say, with the internet, we've got control over it, but really we haven't, because if it went down, I mean, our lives would descend into chaos overnight. If you're under 24, it descend into chaos within 5 minutes. Their whole lives depend on it. So, in a sense, we're having to live with the idea that they're with us for good now. I say they. I'm already thinking of them as sort of, evil demons. But the machines are there to stay, aren't they? It's a case of, when you think, what's happened in the last 50 or 60 years, in our lifetime, say 60, 70, 80 years, we've gone from something which is pretty primitive, really, to where we are today. So you think, well, what the hell is another 70 or 80 years going to bring? I just don't have a clue, Jeff, any more than anybody else. Do you look, if you're an optimist, do you think it's going to be marvellous, they're going to work for us, nobody will have to work more than a 4-day week? Oh, well, we've already got that coming. Or, on the other side of the fence, something could go horribly wrong and he'll end up with Arnold Schwarzenegger, like the Terminator, taking over. Who knows? I don't know, Jeff. I just hope it's the good guys rather than Arnie, but perhaps somebody else has got a view on it. I mean, I don't know.
We're going down the road already.
Well, we are, exactly. As I'm saying, we can't pull back now. In a sense, we can pull the plug out, but in practice, of course, you can't, because civilization, as Greta Thunberg has reminded us, in a sense, not that she wishes to do that, but she's reminding us how, fragile things are. But we can't just, make the changes she wants overnight, because our society would collapse. So, am I a pessimist? I balance a pessimist rather than an optimist, yeah. But not terribly pessimistic. There we are.